Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 393. And this time I'm going to talk about this record from 1979, put out by Chico Freeman on Indian Navigation. This is an original 1979 pressing with the black label. Analog Productions has very recently put out a reissue of this, and if they came even close to the sound quality on here, they'll have done well. Chico Freeman is a tenor sax player, sometimes soprano sax player, and a trumpeter who, since the mid-1970s, has carved out a career playing everything from free jazz to post-bop to straight-ahead jazz. He comes of age musically in avant-garde jazz circles in Chicago in the mid-1970s, and he rises to further prominence, ironically enough, as part of the very traditionally minded new traditionalists in the early 1980s, along with the Marsalis brothers. And so he's got a really intriguing career, particularly that first decade where he's moving from seriously out jazz to seriously in jazz and back again, all within the space of a few years. This record is from right in the midst of that period. It startled his fans when it came out, but for me, it's one of the great jazz recordings of the last 3 decades of the 20th century. Chico Freeman was born Earl LaVon Freeman in July 1949 in Chicago. He's the son of Vaughn Freeman, a tenor sax player, and he's the nephew of George Freeman, a jazz guitarist, and of Buzz Freeman, a jazz drummer. And his father, Vaughn, despite his minimal discography, was one of the best-known jazz musicians in Chicago in the 1950s and 1960s. Vaughn and both his brothers at various points were in the house band at the famous Pershing Ballroom in Chicago in the late 1940s. There, they backed up many visiting stars, including Charlie Parker, a gig that was actually recorded and put out on record. Vaughn also played in an early version of Sun Ra's band in the late 1940s. But despite his talent, he remained in Chicago and thus remained obscure pretty much until the early 1970s, when he made some records with his brother and also recorded as a leader for Atlantic. As for young Chico, his introduction to music started around age 5 on the piano. When he was around 10, his mother took him to a club to go and see his father sit in with the famous Miles Davis Sextet, the lineup that included Cannonball Adderley and John Coltrane. And shortly after, coincidentally or not, Chico starts playing the trumpet. As a child, Chico was surrounded by the jazz associations of his father. People that came to the house included Leroy Vinnegar, Malachi Favors, Andrew Hill, and the great bassist Richard Davis lived across the street. After high school, Chico went to Northwestern University on a math scholarship, actually. While he was there, he changed his instrument to tenor sax, and he changed his major from math to music, and he graduates in 1972. When he graduated, IBM and NASA both tried to recruit him, but instead he'd fallen under the sway of Fred Anderson and the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which was kind of a hothouse for all things free or out in jazz, and Fred Anderson was a major mentor figure for young musicians in that lane in Chicago. Chico began to teach at AACM, and he also pursued graduate studies at Governor State University in Chicago. And at the time, he was also playing with a fusion band called Street Dancer, who put out a fairly obscure record called Rising. But at AACM, another significant mentor for Chico was the co-founder Mahal Richard Abrams, and Abrams convinces Chico that he ought to be leading his own groups. In September of 1976, he makes his first record as a leader called Morning Prayer for a Japanese label actually called Why Not Records. He makes this with a band including Abrams and Cecil McBee, who'd previously played with Yusuf Lateef and was in Pharoah Sanders' band. Now, Chico was aware that staying in Chicago had limited his dad's career, and he had other plans. In the winter of 1976-77, he goes to a Charles Mingus concert in Evanston and asks Mingus if he can sit in. Mingus agrees and calls the next tune, which Freeman remembers was basically 4 or 5 music stands wide as a composition. Anyway, he acquits himself well enough. Mingus is impressed, and he says, "When you come to New York, look us up. We play at Boomers, 340 Bleecker Street, every Saturday." And that was all the encouragement that Freeman needed. In New York, in the next few years, he worked not only with Cecil McBee, but also with Elvin Jones, Sam Rivers, Sun Ra, McCoy Tyner, Don Cherry, Arthur Blythe, and Reggie Workman. And he was soon signed by Bob Cummins, the owner, producer, and Mr. Everything of Indian Navigation Records, for whom he made Chico, his debut for that label in 1977. That was a non-exclusive contract, and Elvin Jones helps him get another one of those around the same time with Contemporary Records out of LA. And over the next 5 years, he was especially prolific, making no fewer than 10 records, 3 for Indian Navigation, including this one, his first, which is Kings of Mali, which is very much an out free jazz kind of record, not inaccessible, but still. This one and The Outside Within, plus 3 for Contemporary, and 1 each for Black Saint, Enya, Columbia, and electro musician. Now again, most of these are what you might call free or avant-garde or out jazz, but not all. For instance, the album Tradition in Transition, which is put out on the label Electro Musician, and Destiny's Dance on Columbia range widely in their accessibility from track to track. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's post-bop, sometimes it's just a swinging groove like people used to play. The Columbia record is from 1982, and it's called Fathers and Sons, and it's kind of a unique, in some ways kind of notorious record because it includes Freeman and his father paired with Ellis Marsalis and his sons Branford and Winton. That record, as you might imagine, is straight up new traditionalist throwback jazz. And this record, Spirit Sensitive, is all standards. Now, for some people, real avant-garde heads, this was a huge letdown. The semi-manic music reviewer Piero Scaruffi, whose website, if you've never encountered, I encourage you to look at just for the sheerness of it all, called Chico's deviation from the free jazz he'd started out with, quote, one of the most blatant betrayals of the original spirit of creative music. And as for this record, he writes that it wasted a quartet of well-known free jazz musicians on a collection of jazz ballads. Strong words indeed. Now, I too have my reservations about the new traditionalists. That's a whole other topic I won't get into here. But I'm very certain of one thing, that this record is a classic. This record is made between October 1978 and January 1979 with Bob Cummins as producer. And it's made at one of two possible locations at which Cummins maintained studios. One of those was the old Western Union building in Tribeca, and the other was his tiny old former water bottling plant in Grandview, New York on the Hudson. Freeman is primarily on tenor on this record, Cecil McBee is on bass, John Hicks is on the piano, and the drums are shared by Billy Hart and Famadou Don Moy. Those two percussive players, whichever one is playing at the time, are largely in the background, as is Hicks for the most part, but that's okay, because the sound quality of this record, for lack of a better word, is exquisite. You rarely hear a bass this well recorded. The record, as foreshadowed, is pretty much made up of standard ballads, which was an unusual thing for Chico and, frankly, for all the rest of these players. And this makes it fascinating. It bears no relationship to the other records he's making at the time, which are all pretty much out. On the other hand, it's years before his work with the new traditionalists and Marsalis mania. So the question is, why? And there's not a lot of evidence, which leaves us, I suppose, theorizing. My theory is that there's an awful lot in common between this record and John Coltrane's ballads. After all, Chico was a huge fan, and remember, when he came to New York, he'd sought out Elvin Jones, McCoy Tyner, and Reggie Workman, and by his own admission, he would have worked with Jimmy Garrison too if he could, had Garrison lived. Anyway, who knows? But if it is an indirect tribute to Coltrane, it's a marvelous one. Side 1 starts with the Vernon Duke classic Autumn in New York, and this is a wonderful duet between McBee and Freeman, and it puts me in the mind of the vibe of that great record Heavy Sounds by Elvin Jones and Richard Davis. The next track is Peace, originally from the Horace Silver record Blowin' the Blues Away. Why can't bass always sound like this? The recording is sublime. There is so much air and space, even when the band moves to double time. The final track on Side 1 is A Child is Born by Thad Jones, which is another gorgeous, achingly beautiful ballad. What more can I say? Side 2 starts with It Never Entered My Mind. You'd have to go a long way, I think, to beat Miles's version on Workin' of this track, and I'm not sure this does, but it's still extremely beautiful. Close to You Alone, which follows, is by Cecil McBee. It's the sole original on this record. And the final track is that old chestnut Don't Get Around Much Anymore. Hicks stands down here, and it's largely interplay between McBee and Freeman, with the odd rhythmic accompaniment from either Hart or Moy. In the past, I'd heard this record here and there in kind of unsatisfactory circumstances, but I'd never seen it in the wild until the other day when I was looking through the Voice of America collection and we came across it. Then, suddenly, 2 weeks later, I'm at my local record store here, and there it is in all its glory. Now, this record might not be representative of Chico's otherwise excellent catalog, and certainly not representative of his avant-garde work, but that doesn't matter. It's wonderful music by some of the greatest musicians of the 1970s, dusting off the songbook, and the sound quality deserves one word: wow. For me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.